What a joy it is to be with you all, and how grateful I am for all you've done for FCNL and this work. Some of you for decades. You know, annual meeting carries special meaning for me. The last time we gathered in person pre-COVID in 2019, I looked very different because by the end of the annual meeting, I was about a week past my due date. So this gathering for me is also a celebration of the birth of my daughter. And I think about how naive I was. There's so much no one tells you as an expecting parent. After giving birth, you're told 6 weeks and you're back to normal. And at 6 weeks, my doctor said, you're good to resume your pre-pregnancy activities. And I had this idea that I would somehow continue my pre-pregnancy life just with a baby alongside for the ride. Obviously, that is not how it works. A baby fundamentally alters life's road. And physically, honestly, it took a full year before I felt like my body was mine again. But I am also a different person in some ways. My identity, my physical and emotional self, my life has been altered. And yet, having a child is the most miraculous blessing. No music, no song, nothing can compete with the sound of your own child's laughter. Holding her little hand in the park as she stares wide-eyed at the carousel, there is no greater joy. While not childbirth, living through COVID these past 20 months has been painful. And with the availability of vaccines, so many of us have been longing to get our pre-pandemic lives back, hugging grandkids, gathering around dinner tables, going to movies, returning to work. Yet our world is forever changed. The pandemic and economic fallout shone a bright light on so many of the structural injustices and inequities in our society. Our country is at a crossroads. Before us lies an opportunity to birth a new kind of society. And the Build Back Better Act puts us on that path. It's not everything, but it could markedly transform the way we as a country support our children, families, and future. Universal pre-K and monumental investments in childcare. Real steps to address the affordable housing crisis and promote housing stability. Over $500 billion towards clean energy and addressing the climate crisis, the largest financial commitment this country has ever made. Protections for immigrants, particularly young dreamers. And what we will speak to our members of Congress about, historic expansions to the Earned Income Tax Credit and Child Tax Credit, which could cut America's child poverty rate nearly in half. What Social Security did to cut poverty among seniors, this will do to cut poverty among kids. So what are these credits? The Child Tax Credit and the Earned Income Tax Credit are refundable tax credits. That means that people who don't earn enough money to owe taxes can still benefit. The credits come in the form of a check from the government. And these credits have a long history of bipartisan support. Paul Ryan proposed an Earned Income Tax Credit expansion, nearly exactly what we're advocating for. Senator Romney's Child Tax Credit proposal mirrors the expansion we're trying to extend. He just pays for it differently. So back in March, Congress passed the American Rescue Plan, which made really important expansions to the Child Tax Credit and the Earned Income Tax Credit, but they are only for 1 year. So unless Congress acts, they'll expire next month. The Build Back Better Act extends all these expansions. So what are those expansions? First, the American Rescue Plan expanded the Earned Income Tax Credit by making it bigger for adults not raising children, a population that is often left out of America's social safety net. The Build Back Better Act extends this for 1 year. The Rescue Plan expanded the child tax credit in 3 ways. First, it made the kid credit larger for all families, increasing the value of the credit from $2,000 to $3,000 per kid and $3,600 for kids under the age of 6. The Build Back Better Act extends the larger credit amount for 1 year. The rescue plan also turned the KID credit into a monthly payment, so families now get this benefit every month. The Build Back Better Act extends the monthly distribution for 1 year. Finally, and most important, the American Rescue Plan allowed families with little or no income to be able to get the full credit amount, what we call full refundability. Before, the parents of 26 million kids couldn't get the full child tax credit because they earned too little money. Now they can. The Build Back Better Act makes this change permanent. This is huge. So, when you are visiting with your representatives and senators, what do you say? If you remember nothing else from my remarks, remember this. We are asking Congress to extend the Earned Income Tax Credit and Child Tax Credit expansions. And in particular, we want to make permanent the expansion that allows families with little or no income to claim the full value of the credit. Democratic offices can do this by passing the Build Back Better Act. Republican offices, we know they're not going to vote for Build Back Better, but we still need their support for these credits. These credits are doing an enormous amount to help families make basic needs. Within the first month that the enhanced child tax credit started going out, the number of adults living in households with children who didn't have enough to eat dropped by 3.3 million in 1 month. Families are using the credit, number one, to buy groceries. Second, utilities and rent. But I want to step back and just share some personal stories. Maureen Boeing lost several sources of income from the pandemic. The child tax credit has been a lifeline, enabling her family to meet basic needs and pay bills, but also those extra things like her son's orthodontist bill. The child tax credit has helped Julia Callahan's family be prepared for unexpected emergencies. When they got a flat tire, the child tax credit was the extra income they needed to fix it. They've also used part of the credit to start a savings account for their 18-month-old. And in the midst of the pandemic, as students braced for another semester of online learning, the expanded credit enabled Nikita Long to buy a computer for her daughter so she could participate in her classes. These credits are reducing poverty and hunger, but they're also helping to ensure a certain quality of life, of orthodontist appointments and college savings. It means Christmas presents and music lessons, birthday cakes and carousel rides. The larger child tax credit amount is important. The monthly distribution is important, but allowing parents with little or no income to claim the full credit amount is the single biggest driver in the huge drops in child poverty in this bill. And that is why making that particular expansion permanent is such a big deal. Now, some want to go backwards and reinstate a work requirement. But shocker, when you impose work requirements in a society that already discriminates against people of color in employment and educational opportunities, you're going to exacerbate racial disparities. Expanding only the maximum credit amount from $2,000 to $3,000 and $3,600 for kids under the age 6, but not making it fully refundable, reduces Black and Latinx child poverty rates by only about 1 percentage point. However, if you expand the maximum credit amount and you enable families with little or no income to claim the full credit amount, that cuts Black and Latinx child poverty rates by 9 percentage points and cuts the racial disparities in child poverty rates by over 40%. Advancing racial justice does not only come in the form of police reform and criminal justice reform and immigration reform. It's also about reversing the policies that prevented people of color from purchasing homes, getting loans, starting businesses, qualifying for Social Security, benefiting from tax breaks, and accumulating wealth. And let's be real about where some of these calls for work requirements come from. Too much of it comes from racist stereotypes about welfare queens and poor people who look a certain way being lazy. We have got to push back. The Build Back Better Act includes these earned income tax credit and child tax credit expansions. And the House is voting this week. And then in December, the Senate will vote. This is not a done deal. And the longer this drags out, the greater the danger that our priorities get cut or compromised. The House has got to pass this bill this week. And then between House passage and when the Build Back Better Act goes to the Senate, there's going to be some changes to fit the procedural requirements, but also Leader Schumer needs 50 votes. And as of now, he does not have that confirmed. I believe he'll get there, but the question is how long will it take and what will be negotiated away? And then, even once he gets those 50 votes, we are expecting hundreds of bad amendments in the Senate. We already know there will be amendments to reinstitute work requirements on the child tax credit, to prevent immigrants from getting the child tax credit, and a host more. We need help from every senator to oppose all those amendments. This is it. This is the moment, the home stretch, to get this bill done. If you help us pass it, it will be marked in the history books. The last time we had this sort of legislative progress was 1965. Some say the New Deal. We may be in a moment of enormous opportunity, but I am fully aware that it is juxtaposed by the harsh political dynamics surrounding us. When congressional offices and their families receive death threats because they dared to vote for a bipartisan bill that would benefit their constituents, dared to put a functioning government above party loyalty. When school board meetings grow violent because parents fear their kids may learn the very real history and reality of racism in this country. When a 12-year-old Black boy is killed by police for simply carrying a toy gun, while a 17-year-old white kid can cross state lines with a very real and illegally acquired assault rifle, shoot 3 people, killing 2 of them, and then be treated as a toddler. When there are huge banners and signs prominently declaring F. Biden, the elected president of this country, in blatant display for my 2-year-old to see, when members of Congress find it amusing to publish cartoons where they violently kill a Latina congresswoman and the US president, and then not one person in party leadership says a word, I have to say, I don't know what to do with that. The level of hate and vitriolic anger and blatant racism that is out there, it's depressing. And the feeling of powerlessness over where this country could be headed is overwhelming. Scripture may not provide immediate solutions or easy answers, but it does provide some context. What we are witnessing is nothing new. The Apostle Paul's life demonstrates this perfectly. Paul travels, sharing the good news, sharing a new worldview. What he teaches is different from what people are used to. It doesn't fit the neat history of what they've been told. Violence erupts. Parents don't want their kids learning this new theory, this new way of relating to the world. Can you see where I'm going with this? Paul's preaching in Ephesus actually causes a riot because it is impacting the pocketbooks of the business elites. You see, Paul tells the people not to put their faith in material objects. And now those who have profited handsomely from selling those material objects are angry because their bottom lines are affected. In Jerusalem, a crowd surrounds Paul, drags him out of the temple, pummeling him with fists and death threats because he's preaching love and hanging out with folks not like them. He is arrested, and the governor, Felix, is more concerned about upsetting a certain base of people and getting a bribe than he is with justice. Let me say that again. Rather than holding a racist mob accountable for storming the temple and inciting violence on groundless fears and conspiracy theories, this political leader is more interested in campaign contributions and his political power than he is about justice. How did Paul get through it all? While Paul started his life dependent on himself, he ended his life dependent on something bigger. Paul had faith in the Almighty. Rather than trying to control the world, Paul focused on his place within it. He found his calling, driven to be God's hands and feet, and he just kept going. Persistent in his work, undaunted, undeterred, Paul didn't turn away. Although a Roman citizen, he didn't hide in his privilege. He didn't decide to just focus on his nephew's swim meets or numb it out by binge watching Succession. And he didn't throw that anger and vitriol right back. He didn't respond with violence or turn around with his own F. Demetrius banners. Paul models a way forward. And when I think of that way, I think of FCNL. Like Paul, we are steadfast in our values, refusing to turn away from the mess of the world without being succumbed by it. Knowing that we are not in control of the world, but focusing on that which we can control to bring about the beloved community. The beloved community, which enables human flourishing for all, from parents struggling to pay for a child's braces to the ones chanting, "Let's go, Brandon." We will go forward, boldly pursuing that vision of the world we seek, and we will just keep going. My daughter loves that carousel at the park. We often talk about a revolution, but you know what the definition of a revolution is? You go around and you end up in the same spot. That is the technical definition of one revolution. But at that park, there's also a kids' train. And my daughter loves that train even more than the carousel. The train always moves forward. Build Back Better is no carousel. We are propelling ourselves forward ever nearer to the world we seek. Because when we come together as a community, when we light up the halls of Congress and the phone lines of Russell and Dirksen and Hart and Rayburn and Cannon and Longworth, and when we speak truth with love as relentless advocates, we light up the way before us to birth a new normal where all toddlers have birthday pies and carousel rides, a new normal where pre-kindergarten is universal, a new normal where parents no longer pay more on childcare than they do on rent, a new normal where the U.S. finally joins the ranks of other countries to offer paid family and medical leave, a new normal where we're doing more to reduce carbon emissions than we are increasing COVID hospital admissions, a new normal where all politicians put more passion into voting rights than they do a teenager's guns rights, a new normal where masking and scientifically based health precautions are just as popular as Ted Lasso, a new normal where rather than debating the withdrawal of Afghanistan, we're not invading countries in the first place. A new normal where there is abundance and flourishing for all God's children. We are on this path together. It doesn't matter where you are on the way. You are here today. You are needed today. In this moment of America's history, you have a role to play because we are in a moment right now, being called right now as part of a larger story to loose the reins of injustice. A way has opened, an opportunity lies before us. As Isaiah reads, I am about to do a new thing. Now it springs forth. I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. We are ready for some ways in the wilderness and rivers in the desert to help transform this nation and create something new, something more beautiful than what was there before. Let us pull up the dawn of a new era, guided forward by God's blazing love and grace to birth a new kind of society, a new kind of community, a new kind of future for our world. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your work. Now let's go out and lobby and get Build Back Better signed into law.
Thank you, Amelia. You carry such passion, a passion that so many people who you work with, so many people who are on this call feel. Maybe we aren't all quite as eloquent as you are in throwing that out and laying it down, but wow, thank you for that. Thank you for the reminder of what we're doing here. We're not simply asking legislators to pass a bill. We are asking them for justice. We are asking for equity. And that's a big deal. And this is a moment of opportunity that I haven't seen in my decade of time at FCNL. And as you said, some people may not have seen since the 1960s in terms of change. So I want to get into a little bit of description about some of the politics and more about the policy of what's going on right now, help people think about what kind of pushback they may get in congressional offices, or what kind of stories even they may want to make sure that they tell. So let me start by saying this bill has had different names, right? The White House and President Biden, who has proposed the bill, call it the Build Back Better, but it's also known as the Reconciliation Bill. And some people can come up with different names. So give us a little bit of the policy politics framework as we go in, how we're talking about it. And what you mentioned that we may see a vote in the House. Love to have you just tell us, lay out a little bit of the timeline, because it's certainly been up and down, back and forth and all around. And so just go ahead and talk about that for a little bit. And then I'm going to come in and ask some more specifics about what's in the bill.
Sure. So yeah, it has got, there have been many, as you said, names about how this bill has been termed. It was the reconciliation bill before it had an official title, because that was the budget process that they were using to pass it. So it would avoid a filibuster in the Senate. But now it's got a title. It's the Build Back Better Act. And so that's sort of what we are now calling it. And that's what most folks on the Hill are calling it as well. And as for the timeline, so yes, we have been, if you talk to congressional offices, we have been on the cusp of passing this thing for a while, but now we really are down to the wire here. So the bill is about to going before the House. We expect to vote potentially Friday. We'll see. It might be Saturday, but the House is going to vote on this. Then it goes, as I said, to the Senate, where we expect some changes, and there are going to be some real big questions about what changes do they make to make sure that they get primarily to line up all 50 votes. And then after that, it'll go through this crazy amendment process that I mentioned, where we're expecting a lot of bad amendments, and then it'll go back to the House again. They need to get this done really before the end of the year, partly because the child tax credit and earned income tax credit, like those expansions end at the end of the year. The last child tax credit check goes out December 15th. So we need to make sure that by January 15th, families are still getting that check.
Okay. All right. There's so many things I want to ask. And we also are getting questions in the YouTube chat. So at the end of this hour, we're going to turn back to Annie and have her give us some of those questions. But let's go to that issue. Let's go to the child tax credit and talk a little bit more. So the American Rescue Plan raised the amount of money that families get. It also extended it to more families. And I think where this got my attention is I was talking to someone in my family, extended family in the Midwest, who I didn't necessarily think that they would qualify for the child tax credit. And they talked about the fact that, yeah, they were going to start getting this child tax credit, deposited in their bank account, and what a difference it would make, So you spoke about some of those differences for some families, but I think anyone who either themselves has had to make choices about what they spend their monthly income on, or have seen that in their extended family, where there's a choice about whether you can pay for your child to have particular kinds of music lessons or play in the soccer team, or even whether you can buy certain food at the grocery store because of the end of the month, or or whether you have to make a choice about paying for your light bill or paying for your internet bill. I mean, we really are talking about that for some families. That's the choices that are being made. And it is about quality of life, but it's also about basic education and access to food and services. So the thing that I think is also elegant about the child tax credit is the way it's administered, right? That there is already a system set up through a federal government so that this just kind of shows up. It's almost like a guaranteed monthly income. Can you say a little bit more about that and why, extending that can really make a difference over time beyond why, the essence of needing to do that beyond this second pandemic year and why we are so excited about the possibility to extend that certainly within the Build Back Better bill, but also beyond even what's in the bill?
Yeah, great question, Diane. So yeah, what we actually have with the child tax credit expansions, we now have a child allowance in this country, much like a number of other countries. And it is sort of a form of universal basic income that goes to nearly all parents. And I mean, I can get into all sorts of things about how beneficial this credit is, but I'll just point to one study that came out of California that actually showed that families who do receive a sort of child allowance or universal basic income, their incomes went up over time, right? That space and that allowed people to actually get a better job, right? And we saw so the benefits for families over the long term is really, really huge. This really is investing in families. And when you look at where our resources go as a country, we actually do a terrible job compared to other countries in investing in children. And so the Build Back Better Act, particularly through the child tax credit expansions, but really through so many provisions of the bill, really put a whole lot more into investing in our children and our future.
Right. People who are part of FCNL know that we've long talked about where investments federal taxpayers go. And we have some disputes with how Congress prioritizes some of those investments into the Pentagon. This is an opportunity to make investments in people. And we're focusing right now on children and families. And there are other parts of the bill that we may want to get into and talk a little bit. But I want to just stick with the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit both. And we'll go to that in a minute. I want to talk about this issue around work requirements, because as you pointed out, this is a live question. It's something Senator Manchin has raised. We expect that we might see some amendments on it. People may get that question when they go into an office. They may have someone saying, well, don't you think people should have to work? And, my guess is a lot of us love work and we think work is good. And we do think it's a good thing for people to work. But is this an anti-work bill? Is it going to discourage work? So say a little bit more about that, and why is it okay for government to support families who may not be fully employed? I think that's a legitimate issue. Let's talk about it.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Diane, and something certainly we have heard a lot about. And this, for those who were lobbying with us in 2018 would remember, we were pushing back against them about putting work requirements on nutrition assistants. I mean, part of it is, one, basically, hands down, we shouldn't be punishing kids because of their parents' work status. And this is about kids and investing in children and their future. So I think that's kind of bottom line. But I think the other piece of this is, like, work requirements are unnecessary and don't work. So the vast majority of families who receive the child tax credit are already working. And those who aren't are either in between jobs or they're elderly, caring for really young kids under the age of 2, or sick or disabled. So you think about, we don't want to be taking away the child tax credit from grandparents who are primary caregivers of their grandkids, and just how work requirements really wouldn't really help in terms of do much in terms of labor force participation. But the other thing is, we actually have concrete studies that show that providing the child tax credit doesn't actually lead parents to leave the workforce. We've seen that from studies both in Canada and in the US. And then also there's that study I'd mentioned out of California that shows that giving people extra money actually helps them get better jobs and leads to higher incomes in the future. The other thing is, I stressed in my remarks how allowing families with little or no income to claim the full value of the credit, that is the single biggest driver in the huge drops of child poverty from this bill. That cutting child poverty by nearly 50%, like that is because we don't have work requirements on the child tax credit. Of the 4.1 million kids who are lifted out of poverty by the overall child tax credit expansions, 3.6 million are lifted out of poverty from allowing parents with little or no income to claim the full value of the credit. So I think those are just a few examples of why, like, it's just a terrible idea to impose work requirements.
One of the things that we've been thinking about is just when did this decline, start that in our country where we stopped investing in families, and that's I was reading a op-ed, some of the people may have seen that, about like during the Reagan era, about how we began making cuts to a lot of safety net programs that have had a dramatic impact on households and families. And I also remember reading about, we talked about the 60s when we began investing in the elderly in our country and creating programs that supported people who are retiring, who are elderly. I mean, the fact is that we invest in people, they flourish. And so that's kind of a bottom line that we need to think about. I want to thank you for sharing this story and reminding me. I remember 2 years ago when you did look different, and remember like watching you take long walks. You were waiting for delivery. But when we were talking about this session for annual meeting, one of the things I shared with you is that when my children were young, I remember thinking about the fact that we weren't in poverty. We had sufficient funds to pay for the sort of extras. I mean, we weren't a wealthy family, but we were strictly middle class. But they went to school with children who were poor. And I could see the challenge of having, even we don't want to see any children poor, but it doesn't benefit our children to be with children who are poor either. I mean, there is a benefit for everyone when we invest in children. It is certainly for those households, but it is for society at large. And that not just the economic opportunities for the whole families, but the educational and economic futures of those children make a difference now if we invest when they're born and when they are growing up. So talk a little bit more about some of the other features, even though we're going to focus on the child tax credit. Can you just name a couple of the other things you mentioned? Preschool, what's in the bill still and what's being talked about? Talk a little bit about that if you would.
Sure. Yeah. And just to quickly say, yeah, we also have a lot of data that shows that kids who get the child tax credit and earned income tax credit do better in school, right? Are healthier as adults, have higher incomes as adults, are less likely to be involved in the criminal justice system. So we know that these initial kind of investments have huge benefits for society over the long term. But yeah, this bill has a lot. Like, that's why it's so historic. The child tax credit and earned income tax credit provisions alone are historic. But, we've been talking with some congressional offices where it's like, if you were to take everything in this bill and each of those provisions was a single bill, we'd be going bonanzas over the just number of legislative victories we've been having. So there is a lot. Like, the childcare provisions are just huge and go alongside with the universal pre-K pieces in there. I mean, you think about just how incredibly unaffordable childcare is for so many families, and how incredibly important that is for parents to be able to work and have like a sense of, to know that your kid is okay while you're working is also incredibly important. So those pieces, there's also, people may have read about, there was dispute, but in the House version right now, there is still the paid family and medical leave provisions in there. It's 4 weeks, which has gotten trimmed down, but it is still in there. Also hugely important. And of course, like, enormous investments in climate change, as well as the immigration provisions that provide really important protections for many undocumented individuals. So it's just, you can just go down the list. There again, this bill, if it passes, will truly be transformational.
So I want to invite you to talk a little bit more about some of those provisions, because I do know that there are people who care a lot about the other elements that are in the bill around immigration and around climate change. But I also want to just name one other thing. When you compare the cost of childcare, which again, if anyone has children or grandchildren, you know that people are paying a lot, right? The other thing people pay a lot for in this country is housing. And there are some pretty amazing provisions and investments in affordable housing in this bill as well, that have the opportunity to address homelessness, as well as to prevent people from falling into homelessness or falling behind on rent. So I just wanted to, if you want to mention anything more, please do. But I wanted to lift that up as really an important investment in this as well. But let's talk about climate change a little bit, because clearly this has been an important platform for this administration to address climate change. The initial recommendation in the bill got taken out, but there still is a lot of investment in there that would go a long way to support renewable energy and to address climate change. So can you talk just a little bit about that as well, Amelia?
Yeah, I mean, you pretty much said it. Hundreds of billions of dollars to really promote clean energy is just to really help us getting in that direction. That is huge. I mean, of course, we were incredibly disappointed when the Clean Electricity Performance Payment Program was taken out. We wanted to see that in. We want to see a price on carbon included. And so this is one of those areas where, this is what we do as faithful advocates, right? We're going to get this bill passed, and then we're going to come right back around and start lobbying for the carbon tax and all of the other things that didn't make it in this bill. But I think we don't want to lose sight of, like, as you mentioned, so many of the historic and really major investments that are still in this legislation.
So before we get to questions, let's talk a little bit about the provisions that address immigration. That has been another area of policy work that has been a real frustration in Congress, honestly. And I don't want to put it all linked to just the Build Back Better bill, because there's a much greater array of legislation that we're tracking, that Anika, who's our lobbyist in this area, is paying attention to. But there's specifically some hopes that there would be some ability to move forward in some elements of addressing issues of immigration. So can you say a little bit about that? Because people probably have read a little bit about the parliamentarians' decision, what can be in, what can be out. So just give us a little background on that, if you could.
Yeah. So I will stress too, again, if you want to know more of any of these things, the Lunch with the Lobbyist sessions are a great way to kind of really get into the nitty gritty of all the details, both with Clarence and with Anika. So on the immigration provisions, couldn't get, because they're moving this bill through a specific process that allows them to avoid the filibuster in the Senate, there are a lot of procedural requirements, and a lot is up to the parliamentarian. And so a clear pathway to citizenship for Dreamers, for TPS recipients, farm workers, and other essential workers was essentially, the parliamentarians said that did not pass the requirements. So they're moving forward with they've worked out a few different strategies right now. They're looking at really protections for many of these communities, and that would allow for work authorization, protections from deportation for like a 5-year period that then could get renewed for another 5-year period. So that's kind of what they're looking at. I think there's a lot up in the air on that provision, both on the parliamentarian. We don't know if this is how the parliamentarian will rule on that provision yet, but then also to get the votes to be able to pass the bill with those provisions included as well.
Okay, I'm going to play a difficult member of Congress or congressional office for just a minute and ask you to answer a question, because we have some answers. Even we anticipate these because you've heard some of them when you've been in offices. So here it is. So this Build Back Better bill, it was a $3 trillion bill, and we've been able to whittle it down so it's not that big, but it's still way too big. Why do we have to make that kind of, how can we even afford to spend that kind of money that this is not the time to be spending that money. It's just way too big.
Yeah. So a few things on that. I mean, I think one of the pushbacks we hear along those lines is people aren't necessarily only saying it's too big. They're saying we're spending too much money and they're worried about deficits. And that drives me bonkers because this bill is paid for, right? There are some really important revenue provisions in here that raise taxes on wealthier individuals and corporations. And so it is pretty much entirely offset. There's one small provision that we expect the Congressional Budget Office sort of disagrees with some of the other analysis on, but overall, this bill is paid for. And the other thing that's, if you care about deficit reduction, most of the spending pieces go for, the investments are for maybe a couple years, 10 years, but most of them expire at some point. We're going to have to do a lot of work to keep them going. But the revenue increases don't expire. So after 10 years, we're raising a bunch of money that is not really, that's just going for deficit reduction. So if you care about long-term deficit reduction, this bill is a great bill for you. And then I think just on the whole kind of we're spending too much overall, I think FCNL advocates are in a great position to be like, well, let's compare that with what we spend in the Pentagon, right? Like, so I think there are many different responses to that pushback.
Well, and we've really avoided trying to talk about go in and say, we want you to pass this bill that is this size. What we want are the elements of the bill because we know what they can do. And that kind of investment, I mean, anyone who has thought about that it does cost something to make investments because you get outcomes and you get returns on that as investments. And that's what we're really talking about. We're talking about the kinds of returns that we know will pay off. Maybe not, we'll have benefits for our society and for human beings to flourish in our society. And so that's really what this is about, I think. But I'm glad you mentioned how the revenue aspects of it, because while we haven't led with that as our advocacy, you have been pretty involved with some coalitions that have been paying attention to those revenue opportunities. And particularly, those are very popular to ask corporations that aren't paying taxes to pay taxes and to look at the disproportionate benefits that a few small number of billionaires receive versus what other people receive. And that's some of what's in this bill for revenue raising, I believe. If you can, do you want to say anything more about that? And then I will turn to you, Annie, for some questions from YouTube.
Yeah, well, I always love talking about tax policy. So absolutely. I mean, yes, I would say when you look at the revenue provisions are important because they have help pay for our investments, right? But they're also great policies in and of themselves. As you mentioned, there are so many wealthier individuals and corporations who are paying very little or no tax. And we need to bring some fairness and equity to our tax code because also we're to be able to invest in the things and create the society that we know we can and should have, that's required. But I also want to pinpoint just the ways in which our tax code, particularly tax or doesn't tax wealth and favors wealth, that has really perpetuated the racial wealth gap. And there are so many areas within our tax code that do continue to perpetuate the racial wealth gap. But that is one area that is just, I think, egregious in terms of our tax policies that could really do a lot if we made some revisions there to bring much more equity to our tax code and our society.
Thank you for bringing that back to the notion that this is a bill that does take steps to address racial inequities in not only the tax code, but in the distribution of some of the resources from it. And I think as we have talked about the need for addressing equity, it's important to understand that this is a bill that will help do that. And I thank you for lifting that up again. Okay, Annie, do we have any questions in the YouTube chat?
Yes, we do, Diane. There's actually a very robust conversation happening in the chat right now. A lot of back and forth, a lot of comments. It's really clear to me that, this legislation brings up a lot for a lot of people. This is legislation that really affects people's lives. And, I just wanted to mention that we are seeing some use of the oops and ouch language in the chat, and that's good. We're glad that we're embracing that. And, these are sometimes very difficult conversations, and we're not going to have them perfectly. And so I'm just really excited to see that we are, as a community, striving to be better in this way together. And before I turn to questions, I just want to say one other thing, which is, Amelia, after your beautiful speech, you didn't get to hear the roaring and raucous applause that I know is happening all across the country. I pulled a few quotes. Someone said, if we could hear each other, we'd hear lots of clapping and cheering and crying. There were so many amens and preach it, lots of tears, a mic drop, people saying they were so excited to lobby and that they want to get this passed. So I just want you to know how impactful that speech really was for folks. But with that, I want to turn to a couple of questions. I do want to acknowledge that we don't have time to get to all the questions in the chat, but Abby has also been dutifully responding in the chat with questions, with answers. And whatever we don't get to here, we do also have that office hours happening today at 5:30. So definitely come swing by office hours. Amelia will be there. Abby will be there. I think a couple other staff members will also be there. So fear not, plenty of time to get all your nitty-gritty questions answered. But someone asked, Ross asked, okay, so this one stumped me. So Amelia, are you ready? Does CBO score the positive budgetary impacts of programs that reduce demands on social services and programs and give now vulnerable people the chance to become healthy tax-paying workers going forward?
That is a great question. So I think what you're referring to is what often called dynamic scoring. And so looking at just not what the initial cost of something is, but sort of the long-term impacts. I've heard this most often talked about in the context of, say, tax cuts. People say, oh, you cut taxes, it's going to cost that much money, but it's going to lead to so much economic growth that we really shouldn't count it as costing that much money. And the argument being, well, if you can do that on the tax side, you should be able to do that on the spending side. So I think there have been a lot of pushes to do that. My understanding is that it gets pretty complicated and hard to actually measure out what those long-term costs are. So I believe the CBO scores that the Congressional Budget Office scores that are coming out right now, and I think we'll have the final budget score hopefully Friday, it will not include sort of those additional dynamic pieces.
That's great. Thank you so much, Amelia. So we had a couple of questions that were sort of getting at, how do you battle sort of the disinformation that you might get in some offices, such as one example is, I'm hearing from people that extra money coming in is helping people quit. And we have 4 million people who have quit the workforce and it's hurting the economy, which we know isn't true. But how do you respond to, pushback like that from congressional offices?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. I mean, I think there's a lot of data that actually disproves that. And the reason why people aren't going back to work is not because they're getting this extra, whether it's $250 or $300 a month. It's usually because they're getting paid too low. The work conditions aren't great. And let's be honest, like the childcare situation. Throughout this pandemic, so many childcare centers had to close down. It led to, we have seen just huge, a lot of women leaving the workforce. And so it's not because people are getting these additional benefits, it's because they don't have access to reliable childcare. They're not going into workplaces that they feel are safe. And so I think there's a lot of data to show that that's just not an accurate assumption.
Absolutely. And Abby sent a really helpful resource in the chat that I hope that folks are able to check out on a blog post that FCNL has actually written sort of about how to combat some of this pushback. Similarly, another question asking, what if people want to know, how are we ensuring that the money actually goes to benefit kids? How do we make sure the money is being spent well once families have the money?
I mean, there's no accounting, right? We don't go and check in on how people are using this. I think we leave it up to families because we know families know what's best for them and for their kids. In the same way that the IRS with with everyone else's refund checks, they don't go around kind of checking, what are you spending your refund check on? So there's oftentimes this additional scrutiny that we place on lower income families that I think, families are just trying to get by. And the other thing is like the data any concerns that folks have that people are not using this money wisely is disproven by the data, right? By the fact that like the number one usage of the child tax credit when those expanded benefits started coming out was on groceries, number one, and second was on rent and utilities. So we know it's going to pay for basic needs. And then I think the other thing is bringing in those stories, right? To show there's just so many, a plethora of stories of families talking about, parents talking about how they're using these benefits. And it's going to like saving for their kids. It's going for, those braces, it's going for the music lessons. So it's, I think there's just a wealth of information out there that just proves that.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad that you also mentioned the ideas of stories, because we're going to hear some stories from folks later on in this programming. And I think that is such an important aspect of our lobbying, and the real power of our constituent lobby visits is that you don't need to have every single answer to push back, but you need to make sure that the office knows how important you think this legislation is. And you do that through your stories. So sort of switching gears a little bit and thinking more about the actual visit, my senator, let's imagine my senator says these decisions are being made by leadership and they don't have any influence on these issues. What do you say to that?
So I would say that every senator, every member is important in this vote. Let us remember how tight the margins are. So two things. One is the member can do a lot to be talking to leadership and to be talking to their colleagues, particularly if let's say your member is like totally on board and it's like, I'm totally supportive of Build Back Better, there's nothing I can do. That member has relationships with other members that they can be lobbying and telling, hey, these are really important provisions. We got to keep them strong. We got to get this bill across the finish line. And to say, yeah, hold firm on this stuff. The other piece that I mentioned is in the Senate, I mean, we are expecting hundreds of bad amendments that are going to be that will be very hard for many members to vote against, because a lot of them are being political messaging, and we need, that's going to take every single member, everyone we can get to push back upon. So I think that's the other piece. And then the other thing that I would just finally mention is, particularly with Republican offices, the Build Back Better Act only extends much of the earned income tax credit and child tax credit expansions for 1 year. So we're going to have to come right back around and get these expansions extended further, made permanent ultimately. And that's going to require Republican support.
Well, and that actually tees up my last question perfectly before we have to move on to our next programming, which is, can you just say a little bit more about, for our friends who are going into Republican offices, what are the couple of sentences that you want them saying to Republicans who don't support the deal?
They just talk about the importance of the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit. These are, every family, every member has just such a high percentage of the families in their district are getting particularly the child tax credit benefits right now, and what it is doing for their communities, and that we cannot let these expansions expire. And so I think just bringing it back and saying, we really need to ensure that your earned income tax credit and the child tax credit expansions are extended and that we keep them.
Well, that was so great. Thank you so much, Amelia. I know that we didn't get to everyone's questions in the chat, but like I said, we do have those office hours happening at 5:30 Eastern today. So there's definitely a lot more FaceTime with Amelia and with Abby. And really, we're going to make sure that you feel totally confident going into your visits. But a big part of that is just knowing how much you care about this legislation, which based on the chat, I can already see is so true. So we're so excited to have you engaging with us on this really important legislation.
Let me just say thank you, Annie, for bringing those questions to us. You did a great job. Thank you for also sharing what was in the chat, that people are using the oops and ouch, and that, you know, we'll look, we can't see that. Amelia and I can't see that in the view we're in. So helpful to know that, and helpful to know there's a real dynamic engagement on this. And I just want to reflect, this is also legislation that is gender positive for women. A lot of the kind of idea that this notion of how do we know people will spend their money well, that is just you know, a kind of paternalism that is not that we need to lose. We need to trust people to do what's right for their families, and we need to trust mothers and fathers to do what's right for their children. And this legislation sets up a system that can happen. And so, and it's also proven. And I want to just go back and say one more thing before we go on to our next programming, which people may have missed. While we do not have bipartisan support for the Build Back Better plan right now, the elements that we are talking about do have enjoyed bipartisan support historically. The child tax credit, the earned income tax credit, many of the provisions for housing vouchers, these historically have had a great deal of Republican support. So while we aren't seeing it in this particular bill, these are not ideas that belong only to Democrats. And that's important to remember as we're having this conversation. These are not based on party affiliation. They're based on what's right and best for human beings, particularly the children who are human beings among us.